In my last video, I created a working definition of morality for the purposes of these discussions. I also discussed how one of the big issues with morality in games is that developers simply don't take the time to communicate the moral stance they have, which leads either to confusion or an unsatisfactory world where good and evil are presented in stark and borderline ridiculous terms. In this video, I'm going to talk about certain patterns that have emerged in game design that, to me, seem to help mitigate the problems between controlling a story and allowing the player to craft said story. I make no claim that these patterns are by accident or design, only that as generalizations, these types of games have the potential to have more coherent design when it comes to story and mechanics. Arguably, the easiest to implement from a mechanics standpoint is the narrative game that limits interaction to very basic elements. Here, most of the game is watching a story unfold in between performing some basic point-and-click actions, quick-time events, and/or most importantly, dialogue choices. While the player influences the story narrative, the actual actions the player can perform are fairly limited. From a story perspective, this is great. The level of input from the player is minimal, the developers have a great deal of control over the direction of the story, and the mechanics are simple conceptually. So what's the downside? Well, the level of input from the player is minimal, the developers have a great deal of control over the direction of the story, and the mechanics are simple and easy. Yeah, its greatest strengths are also potentially its biggest weaknesses. This model of game is made or broken by the story. Since mechanics are very simple, the only thing to draw the player in is if your story is good, your characters are interesting, etc. When done right, this format gives the developers the ability to write a great story without the complication of keeping the mechanics consistent with the story. If you follow the gaming scene, you probably guessed that I'm using The Walking Dead by Telltale Games as a good example of this game. But there are others as well, such as, well, any good point-and-click adventure ever. But this model represents the most extreme example of minimizing player interaction for the sake of the story, and that trade-off will freeze gamers out who derive enjoyment from doing more in their games. This model can be used very effectively to communicate the moral standards that the game abides by. For example, in The Walking Dead, you encounter a situation where you're given the choice to shoot a character who has been bitten by zombies and thus will become a zombie, or defer the shooting to another character. Now, obviously, I have a problem as a Catholic with the concept of mercy killing. Having said that, the game has characters state over and over again that the worst thing that can happen is to become a zombie, express a universal wish to be put down before that happens, you know, the usual. The game gives more than enough information to inform your choices as to why they are those choices, and that allows you to craft a character consistent with those moral views. When done right, this type of game can provide a rich story with enough contextual information to make informed choices. Done badly, these games are a drag with non-existent gameplay and a boring story. A directed experience is a game where the story is set by the development team and the player fulfills the objectives set by the game. Story direction by the player is minimal at best, though some optional and tangential elements may be put in control of the player. Mechanically, the game is wide open for anything, but the story at best is set in stone and at worst minimal backdrop. This is what most games' storylines consist of. Ideally, the story is engaging enough to add context to the actions that take place, while not interfering or contradicting with the actions of the player. The style gives complete control of the story to developers and no player input is anticipated. When used properly, this can provide an incredible experience for the player as they play the role of a character whose context is well defined. The obvious drawback to this design is that the player has few ways to interact with the story itself. No control is given to the player to influence events in a different direction. If sufficient care isn't taken, the player can feel like the game runs on rails, ferrying them from one place to another. For some players, the lack of engagement in the story is a turnoff. So as mentioned, the vast majority of games fall into this category. Everything from Japanese role-playing games to Super Mario could be considered to fall into this classification. It's the most common one and can be argued it's too broad, but this is how stories are managed for most games. The third and final category is the type of story where the developers attempt to distance themselves from any form of moralizing and simply create a world of choices and consequences. In this model, as much control of the story is given to the player as possible while still holding a coherent narrative together. It's designed to allow the player to not only influence the story, but to allow the player to evaluate the morality of any given situation. The positive side is fairly obvious. The story-driven player is given about as much control as he can get while still having a narrative. Moral evaluations of trying to guess the moral perspective of the game is not a problem. All in all, this would seem like a great design for story-driven gamers while getting rid of the complications of communicating morality. There is one tiny problem though. It doesn't work. Or at least I haven't seen it work. In some cases, the lack of moral stakes robs the story of any purpose. In other cases, despite the best efforts of the developers, the moral judgment of the options presented are different in moral weight. There are just too many things that go wrong when one tries to exercise morality from the picture. The most famous example I can think of for this design is The Witcher. Setting aside the mechanics and the wraiths, this game came closest in my opinion to getting this right. The problem is that the story is a middling political conspiracy with few moral stakes and undermotivated choices. I'm not ruling out the possibility that this could work, but ultimately a story without moral conviction is a story that is little more than pointless events. So in conclusion, these strategies have their strengths and limitations. Most of them involve trade-offs at the point of yielding control of the narrative from the dev team to the player at key points. None of them are perfect and all have some drawbacks, and the last one arguably doesn't work. But like any tool, these designs are only as good as the one who wields them. that's all for now. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Hey everyone, thanks for watching my video to the end. If you like more of this, you can click on the subscribe link at the bottom, and as you can see, there are a couple of other videos that you can click on as well. One of them is one of my prior reviews or another content video, and the other one is going to be a playthrough that I'm doing. So feel free to click on either one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks very much.